Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about Hook. So we are officially in the month of December, which means it's time for me to talk about some alternative Christmas movies, which I think Hook is a film that qualifies as being such, because the movie both opens and ends very predominantly around Christmas time. Therefore, that's why I'm talking about this movie today. Hook is a really interesting movie to talk about for a couple of different reasons. It's a movie that has a very unique legacy. On the one hand, this is a movie that's constantly named as being a lesser Spielberg movie, which I think is fair, because Steven Spielberg, the most famous director in history, many of his best movies are also considered to be some of the greatest and most influential movies of all time. E.T., Jaws, Close Encounters, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, Saving Private Ryan. I mean, these are movies that are rightfully named as being some of the greatest, most influential, and important movies of all time. Kind of hard to argue with that. So comparing Hook with those movies feels almost unfair. This movie did not receive good reviews from critics at all. In fact, it's one of Spielberg's lowest rated movies on Rotten Tomatoes. I think it has something like a 29% rating, which I think is a bit too harsh. I mean, I don't think Hook is a perfect movie by any means, but I do think there are some elements that are well made and are fun and are enjoyable. But at the same time, it is definitely a flawed movie. Of course, I'm going to get into all of that stuff. So that's one side of Hook in terms of its legacy. Then the other side is the people that defend this movie, the people that love this movie. I mean, this is a film that I think is one of the few, if not only Spielberg movies that has a legitimate cult following. And there's clearly a lot of nostalgia connected with that. And that's kind of the angle that I'm coming from with this review. So when I was a kid, I, of course, loved this movie. I loved the look of the movie. I loved Robin Williams. I loved Julia Roberts' Tinkerbell, probably one of my very earliest cinematic crushes ever that I can think of. I loved The Lost Boys. I loved Captain Hook in Smee, played brilliantly by Bob Hoskins and Dustin Hoffman. The imaginary food fight scene was a huge highlight for me as a kid. I loved the music. I loved all the fun pirate stuff that's at the end of the movie. And watching it as an adult, there's still a lot of that stuff that I still do enjoy. But it's also a movie that's 2.5 hours long. That definitely does not need to be that long. It feels way too bloated for its own good. It's a movie that suffers from some serious pacing issues, especially when we get to the second half of the movie. There are some plot elements in this movie in terms of like the screenplay writing that feels clunky as hell. And there are some very forced, whimsical, and emotional moments in this movie that doesn't hit like it should hit, especially when you consider that this film was directed by Steven Spielberg. It doesn't have that same emotional weight like his other movies that are very whimsical in nature, like E.T., for example, which was another movie that I loved as a kid and I love even more as an adult. I can't quite say the same about Hook. I'm not going to get too much into the plot of this movie because A, most people have seen this movie, and B, I mean, if you haven't, the premise of the movie is, what if Peter Pan grew up? What if he left Neverland, got married, had kids, got a job, became a boring adult, and what if he had to go back to Neverland because his kids got kidnapped by Captain Hook and he simply doesn't remember his past adventures as Peter Pan or being able to fly or any of these things? And that's the premise and the story of Hook, which is a great idea for a movie. In fact, this movie has all the ingredients of making it like an all-time classic. A sequel to Peter Pan, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Robin Williams, and you got Dustin Hoffman as the bad guy. It's like, how do you go wrong there? And as Spielberg has said himself, he didn't have a lot of confidence in the script, which rewatching this movie is very apparent. The movie opens very strongly, though. I think the movie does a good job of setting up who Peter is now, setting up his family, the relationship he has with his children, really hammering that 90s trope that was in a ton of movies about the dad who's working too hard for his family, and that makes him a bad person, which is a trope that always makes me laugh.
Why didn't somebody just shoot me in the head?
Bang! Bang!
Will everybody just shut up? Oh my God, that is funny!
And then he goes back to England for the holidays with his family to reunite with his grandmother, Wendy. Now, this is a part of the movie where story-wise and logistically, like, makes little to no sense to me. It's not the fact that it's, like, unrealistic. I mean, this is a fantasy movie. That's to be expected. It's that it just doesn't really make sense within the context of the movie. They set this up way later in the movie, but when Peter starts to remember how he became an adult and why he left Neverland and all this stuff, they show that he keeps visiting Wendy throughout the years, but Wendy is getting older. Which, by the way, I totally forgot Gwyneth Paltrow's in this movie. So I was like, holy shit, she's in this movie? I did not remember that at all. They established that he keeps coming back to visit her, but she's getting older. And then eventually she has a daughter, and then eventually she has grandkids, and then Peter ends up falling in love with one of the grandkids, and then he ends up marrying her, and she ends up essentially adopting Peter as like a grandson or a grandson-in-law, I guess. And then during all of this time, Peter just simply forgets about his relationship that he had previously with Wendy, which there's kind of a weird Back to the Future-esque moment in this movie that made me laugh out loud.
I wore a pink satin sash. But you didn't come.
Grandma?
Oh, that's not right. No.
But like, when you start to think about it, it's like, that doesn't make a lot of sense, and the movie doesn't even really try to make it make sense, and so it just feels just awkward and poorly written how Peter evolved from Peter Pan and became an adult. And it just there's stuff there that just doesn't really make sense. And I don't even know how you write that in a way that does make sense, or at least it does so in the context of the movie. Also, during that period in the film where Peter's, they're showing flashbacks of his childhood, and he's like in the 1900s because, he never grew old when he was living in Neverland. He talked about how when he was a baby in a stroller, how he was having existential feelings about becoming an adult because that means you're going to die someday. So he ran away.
I was afraid because I didn't want to grow up, because everybody who grows up has to die someday. So I ran away.
How do you run away when you're a baby in a stroller? In fact, in the movie, like, a bunch of birds come and like knock the stroller down the hill while his mom is talking to some lady on a bench in the 1900s and doesn't even see her baby rolling away. Like, there are moments in the movie where the writing is like really not good and just kind of awkward, especially for a Steven Spielberg movie. And so that was a scene that really stood out to me. Here's another scene that really kind of annoys me. Peter finally gets to Neverland after his whole really fun confrontation with Tinkerbell, which that's a highlight in the movie. I really like the opening of this movie. She ends up pulling the rug underneath him. He flips and, hits his head, and then he's kind of dazed, and then Tinkerbell takes him to Neverland, which all of that stuff is great. So he gets there, and there's some fun, fish out of water comedy stuff that kind of gets a little old after a while because the movie keeps kind of doing that same type of gag and premise over and over again. It's like, okay, we get it. He doesn't remember Neverland. The movie does that a little bit too much. Once again, a lot of stuff that could be cut out to make this not 2.5 hours long. He's in a pirate disguise, and he gets on the boat, and we get introduced to Captain Hook, and we get introduced to Smee. We see that the kids have been kidnapped, and that's when Peter, he's like, oh my god, those are my kids, and Captain Hook is like, you're not Peter Pan, and all that stuff. So instead of like having an organic confrontation where Peter tries to rescue his kids, but he can't because he forgot what it was like to be Peter Pan, to be heroic in any of this stuff, the movie very awkwardly just has Tinkerbell show up. He's like, hey, I got a deal for you, Captain Hook. Give me 3 days and I'll be able to make this the Peter Pan that you remember, and I'll give you the battle that you've always wanted. And he's like, all right, you got a deal. And it's just like, that was such a weird, clunky way of giving the movie an excuse of Peter to essentially be trained by the Lost Boys to become Peter Pan again. Just having Tinkerbell like, all right, well, you have a deal. And it's like, it feels like too juvenile for a Spielberg movie. Like, I realize this is a movie that's meant to appeal to kids. It's meant to be more family friendly, but there are just moments like that where it just feels awkward, clunky, kind of just sloppily written, like the other examples I named earlier. And then we get to the big problem with this movie. So Peter then eventually falls off the boat. He makes out with a bunch of hot mermaids, which I always thought was awesome when I was a kid. And then he meets up with the Lost Boys in very dated 90s type stuff where Rufio's got a triple mohawk and there's a fucking half pipe because it's the 90s, man. Extreme. That was the trend, and they're skateboarding and all this stuff. And there's some fun lighthearted comedic stuff that can come from this, but it goes on for way too long. So much of this movie is just, Robin Williams hanging out with these kids, and we don't even get to see him be Peter Pan until about the last 20 minutes of this movie. In fact, as a whole, there's really not that much action or adventure in this movie, and that's really my big problem with Hook. It's like, That's the thing that Spielberg excels at. He excels at giving you really genuinely exciting, nerve-wracking adventure. And with this movie, there's just a lack of urgency. There's a lack of stakes. There's a lack of anything that really propels the story forward to make it feel genuinely exciting. You know, in the same way that Jurassic Park is exciting, in the same way that the Indiana Jones movies are exciting, in the same way that E.T. gets really exciting, especially during that climax, which I think is one of the best things Spielberg has ever done. The last 20 minutes of E.T. is like pure cinematic bliss. It's so fucking good. And then you compare that to this movie, where, like I said, that the whole middle section of this movie is just so kind of like aimless and meandering. And that goes into the other thing of this movie that really annoys me, is the whole Captain Hook side plot of him like trying to basically steal Peter's kids and make them his own kids and stuff like that. And so we get these really kind of dumb scenes of him like homeschooling the kids, and it's meant to be kind of funny, but it just feels like just really dumb. So yeah, there's just so much of the movie that just feels just kind of clunky and meandering and aimless. And then we get to the last 20 minutes where, you know, Peter finally remembers that, you know, he's Peter Pan, he can fly again, he's got a plan, and to, you know, go after Captain Hook and his men, and he's bringing the Lost Boys with him, and they have all these fun homemade gadgets, and that part of the movie is still fun. The opening of this movie is great, and the ending of this movie is really strong too. The movie has a fun, whimsical ending that's like, oh, that's nice. That feels very, you know, classic Spielberg. But then when you look back after watching the movie, it's like, well, a lot of this just kind of feels like mindless fluff. Which the thing about Spielberg is that he excels at making popcorn entertainment that has some, you know, emotional levity to it, or there's some subtext that you can look into that makes the movie feel, you know, more intelligent than your average mindless popcorn movie. Even though I just said a whole bunch of stuff that I have issues with the movie, I still kind of have a soft spot for this film. I still enjoy a lot of the comedic elements in this movie. I still enjoy the imaginary food fight scene. I think it's fun. I just think all of the stuff with Peter and the Lost Boys goes on for way too long. And like I said, there's no urgency, which there needs to be in order to create some exciting adventure. And then probably more than anything else, the movie's just too damn long, and it feels long as well. So is Hook like a bad movie? Is it the worst Spielberg movie? It's definitely, you know, it definitely goes near the bottom of his list. There's still a lot of Spielberg movies I haven't seen. I will gladly rewatch Hook over Ready Player One easily. I think Ready Player One absolutely sucks. Is it a good movie? I'm going to leave that one up to you guys. I want to hear your thoughts. For those who have seen Hook, what are your thoughts on the movie? Do you like it? Do you love it? Do you hate it? What are some of your favorite Spielberg movies? What are some Spielberg movies that you feel are underrated? List it in the comments